Hello YouTube! In this video we're going to tackle part 2 of the meta discussion regarding hypertrophy training on social media. If you missed it, part 1 released last Thursday, and in it we discussed why and how hypertrophy training lost its way. And today I want to take the discussion further by taking a look at the two camps that nowadays are fighting over the remains of hypertrophy. Two camps that in my opinion perfectly represent what modern lifting has become. On one hand, you have the Meatheads that I chose to represent with the figure of Bugenhagen, and on the other, you have the scientists that are going to be championed by Nippard. My goal being to answer the following question: between scientists and Meatheads, who is right? Who has a rightful claim to hypertrophy? Whose approach is the best? And who is giving the correct advice to get people huge? The reason why I chose to pick these two guys is because, one, they're widely recognizable. You guys seeing the thumbnail knew exactly what I was going to talk about. Two, because I personally am very familiar with their content, but also their mindset. And three, because their ideological differences are plain for everyone to see. No one can claim that this is made up. Bugenhagen has made plenty of videos criticizing the hypertrophy approach, not only of Nippard, but also of the science-based community. So in a sense, he has positioned himself as an antagonistic force to what he perceives to be a subpar method. A method that, in his opinion and in his words, tends to keep people small. But before we start, I want to say three things. One, even though I use these guys' names and likeness in my thumbnail, it does not mean that I speak for them. If you want to hear what they have to say about it, you can go visit their channel, okay? I'm not their spokesperson. The second thing I want to make clear is that the majority of observations that led to my diagnosis of this divide between the two camps mostly comes from memes. And to some, this means that it doesn't really exist. It's just a joke on Instagram or YouTube. And that's personally not the way I see it. To me, memes are a reflection of our collective unconscious. If you want to understand the spirit of a generation, you only have to look at their memes. And this is also true in the domain of ideology. Nowadays, most of ideological warfare exists solely under the form of pseudo-ironical content that is spread on the internet by both sides. This is how they project their idea, and this is how they also ridicule the other side. So in a way, memes are the modern political pamphlets of the 21st century. And in that sense, trying to pretend that they mean nothing to me is ridiculous. If Carl Jung had been alive today, I guarantee you that he would be writing books about the psychological impact of memes on society. So to me, basing an entire argument off of memes and content produced by the community is not only legitimate, it's also absolutely necessary. But I must add that if you're the type of person who is going to comment that you've never heard about this divide and this sounds made up, God bless you, it means that you're out of the loop. Most likely you are doing your own thing and doing tremendous in life. Keep doing you. Don't jump into this online battlefield, you have nothing to gain in it. But if you're already caught in the hurricane and you get all confused about it, this video is for you. It's to help clarify between these two positions by presenting arguments from both sides. And then a third thing before we can start this video, if you like my content and you want to help me continue make videos, I would highly recommend you support this page on Ko-fi. As some of you might remember, I opened this page as an option to be able to keep making content. In that sense, every hour I spend making videos on YouTube is an hour I don't spend working for the company that I'm hired by. This means that if people stop pledging, I will unfortunately no longer be able to make videos and I'll just go back to my job. Naturally, I would prefer to make content for you guys, but it's entirely up to you. I want to extend also, of course, a big thank you to anyone who has kept up their pledge for the past year or even for a month. This means the world to me because keep in mind that without you and without that effort, I would have stopped making videos a year ago. Alright, now that this is out of the way, we're going to be able to start with the first piece of media, the first quote-unquote meme, that I will be starting this conversation with. And it's one that I'm certain many of you are exposed to because it went semi-viral on Instagram. And in this reel, you can see someone who compares the modern approach to hypertrophy with the good old mid-head way of doing the thing, using in this case the example of the lateral raise. So if we look at this comparison, on one hand, we have what I would call the big mover mindset, and on the other, you have the much more dainty, biomechanically sound approach that prefers a more efficient resistance profile using a cable and a much slower tempo. And the point of the clip, the point of this comparison, is to paint this second approach as lame, but also somehow less masculine. It almost looks like to me, if you do cable lateral raises, you're a pussy, and if you do them with dumbbell, then you're a badass, you're a quote-unquote real lifter. And this aligns exactly with what I said in the first part of the essay. The science-based, the hypertrophy-based community nowadays on Instagram and YouTube has gained this reputation for being a bunch of sissies who are afraid of hard work. And actually that's not really receivable because these are not arguments, they're simply ad hominems. They could be true, but I cannot work off of that. And if I take a look, if I dissect this meme right there, it's the same. There are no arguments here, it's just a bunch of logical fallacies. Because if we actually take a look at the clip, we see that it makes no sense whatsoever. The first issue I'm certain you guys have noticed is the fact that first, every single lift that is used as an example of why dumbbell lateral raises are so much better are all IFBB pros, meaning that there are people on a ton of drugs. And this naturally greatly diminishes the strength of the argument because these guys could get big shoulders from pretty much anything. I've been to gyms. I now go to a gym where there is a ton of people who have their pro cards. Some of them are IFBB pros who are well known. And guess what I've noticed? Every single one of these dudes has giant delts, even though they all train differently. Some of them do heavy presses. Some of them do no presses whatsoever. Some of them, I've caught one of these guys doing reverse pec deck with 5 pounds. For reps of 20. I've seen some of them do lateral raises with 60 pounds, with 25 pounds. It doesn't matter. They all have the same exact physique. And every time I've run into someone who is openly on PEDs, they always have giant traps and giant shoulders. This means that the exercise selection that these guys chose for their training regimen is mostly relevant. It's the response to the drug that gets them these results. So using them as an example why a shoulder exercise is better than another is already highly disingenuous. But then you also have the second issue, which is that the comparison is not fair. On one hand, you have dudes who are going heavy, and it is their top set, and on the other, you have the guy who made the video, I suppose, who is doing cable lateral raises with no weight whatsoever, so no intensity. And if you don't match the intensity profiles of two lifts, well, naturally, the lift where the intensity is applied is going to be superior. I could do the exact same thing. I could show you footage of Tom Platt doing leg extensions and then compare it by like filming some like zoomer at my gym who does barbell high squats with 90 pounds and not even close to failure and tell you, hey, look, this means that leg extension is much better for quads than squats. That, of course, would be completely dishonest, but that's exactly the method that was employed here. And so that's another reason why this clip is not actually proving anything. It's because it's already working off of people's preconceived notions. Most people already agree with the clip. And this also points to an interesting cliche. Somehow, cable lifts in particular have gained a reputation for being very easy movements, which makes some people think that you cannot possibly build serious mass on them. And that's something that we verified last time with the iliac pull-down, where I demonstrated actually it was entirely backwards, it was the exact opposite. That the iliac pull-down was one of these variations that should be pushed to failure, and you could be much more intense on it because it targeted the muscle in priority. It targeted the lats in priority. And wouldn't you know it, the exact same thing is true here. The entire point of using cuffs and cables for lateral raises is that when you do it like this, one, you are no longer limited by your grip. Then there's also the issue of the resistance profile. When you do your dumbbell lateral raises, you will quickly find out that controlling the negative is extremely difficult. So oftentimes your negatives will be quick, and the deeper you go into the set, the quicker they will become because the more fatigued you will become. There's also the issue of the fact that when your arms are by your side at the end of the negative, there's no tension on the side delt, whereas there would be tension if you use the cable. And then there's also the involvement of the traps. Now, the fact that dumbbell lateral raises might hit your traps just as hard as your side delts is not necessarily a bad thing, but if it becomes a limiting factor for the development of the side delt and you end up with giant traps and tiny delts, then yes, it's an issue. Because why do you do lateral raises? You don't do them for traps, you do them for delts. So if your traps take over, that is an issue. And if a variation with a cable and a cuff can correct it, then it's a superior variation. That is just logical. So, accepting this, the intensity part of the argument that apparently is on the side of the dumbbell variation should actually be on the side of the cable. Yes, cable lateral raises are much more intense than dumbbell lateral raises because what matters with intensity is not how red your face looks or how much you move your body or how much you cheat to get the weight up. It's how much pressure and stress and mechanical tension is put on the muscle. It starts and ends there. But that raises another interesting question. If the lift is objectively better, and by objectively I mean that you can produce more argument in favor than against, why are there so many people who are opposed to it? Well, in my opinion, it's because of what I explained previously with the badass appeal of the lift. Visually speaking, it is much more heroic, much more engaging, much more energetic to do your lateral raises with dumbbells. Then you also have to add to this the layer of history and legend that surrounds the movement. Lateral raises done with dumbbells were hyper popular during the golden era, and they were also all over these documentaries and these motivation videos that I'm certain we all watched growing up, we all watched as young men getting into bodybuilding. It might also very well be that your first isolation movement for the delt was the dumbbell lateral raises. So you have an emotional connection to it. Because the day you decided you wanted Death Star delts, this is the lift you turned towards. The problem is that it was never a discussion about whether or not that lift was more badass than the cable variation. The discussion was which lift is better for hypertrophy. And when faced with this contradiction, some people might resort to a good old appeal to tradition by saying, for example, that we've always done it, so why should we do something new if the old method was working? And this is personally the type of argument that makes me dislike the Meathead side of the argument so much. Because it's not an argument. It's an appeal to emotion, it's an appeal to tradition, but there's no substance to it. As I said in part 1, our goal as lifters, influencers or not, should be to perfect our craft. And that takes not necessarily reinventing the wheel, but trying to find better ways to use the wheel. So telling people to keep things exactly the way they were 50 years ago is not just stupid, it's also intellectually lazy because it's not getting us anywhere. If our ancestors had thought like this, in the domain of fitness at least, we would all still be lifting kettlebells or whatever implement we can get our hands on. Barbell back squats would not exist because the squat rack would have never been invented. Bench press, invented by George Hackenschmidt, would have never been invented because you also need a bench rack to do it. And so many other great variations done with machines and cables would be completely void from existence because, well, why would we need to do something else? We can just stick to the old ways. The only way to salvage this mentality would be if the new method was worse than the previous method. In this case, yeah, sure, let's stick to tradition, let's be conservative. But in this case, guys, I can only tell you to go out and get your own pair of cuffs. It has personally changed my relationship with lateral raises. I hated doing them with dumbbells, and even with the cable, I didn't like holding onto that handle. When I moved to cuffs, I got a better mind-muscle connection because I could stop focusing so much on squeezing that fucking handle. I can also vouch for the fact that you can use more weight and more reps. So if you're into the big mover mindset of more weight equals better, good. Cuffs also allow you to do that. But worst case scenario, you try them out, you find out you don't like it, and you just go back to the good old ways. It is stupid to refuse to attempt something new when this thing could be a net benefit for your fitness journey. And I know that nowadays it's become sort of a trend to shit on Nippard because, well, he's hyper popular. He has become the Mr. Beast of YouTube Fitness. And so if you're going to direct an attack at the science-based crew, you're going to target him because that's what is going to get you the most attention. But oftentimes, when I consult the attacks of other people against Nippard, I end up becoming the biggest Nippard fanboy because times and times again, these people look like complete morons in opposition to him because their attempts at producing arguments fail. And that leads me to the next part of this argument where we'll be discussing the fatal flaw in the meathead mindset, which also coincidentally happens to be the weakness of the science-based ideology. And to introduce that element, please take a look at evidence number 3. So this is exactly what I was talking about with people taking shots at Nippard, not realizing that it makes them look worse in comparison. First, because the guy who is making fun of Jeff is smaller than him by a mile. And if you want to be all meathead and saying, well, I lift heavy and I'm such a bro, you better be big as fuck. Because this argument only works if you're big. You can sort of like get by if you're like a stick, but you have degrees and you're all about science and biomechanics, that somehow works. But if your entire shtick is, my method works because I got big, you have to be big, or else it just is irrelevant. But beyond just roasting a random Indian bro, let's look at the absence of arguments in this footage, because once again, we're witnessing someone who is on purpose presenting two movements that demonstrate a complete intensity mismatch. Because on one hand, you have a guy who is clearly doing his top sets, clearly training to failure, and maybe even using weights he has no business using. And on the other, you have a lifting demonstration. You have a guy, Jeff Nippard, who is using baby weights because he's showing people how to do the movement. And this is the biggest problem with the big mover mindset I speak about so often. These are oftentimes dudes who fetishize compound movements because they're hard and heavy, but at the same time looking at isolation movements like this complete waste of time because you can't be intense on it. Let's be clear, if you meet someone who tells you that it's impossible to be intense on a curl, you just have met someone who has never trained biceps seriously. Because it's absolutely possible to grind and to push as hard on your preacher curl as you would on the deadlift. Would the total amount of muscles and nerves firing at the same time be equivalent? No, of course not. But when you train biceps, that's not what you're looking for. You're looking for a lift that specifically targets the bicep, and since it's a smaller muscle, it's going to also accrue less fatigue overall. That doesn't mean that isolation movements are easier, only that they're less taxing. So the entire not intense enough shtick to me is just an excuse. In my opinion, it's just people who have a problem with any movement that is done specifically for the sake of hypertrophy. But at the same time, they also have this weird schizophrenic attitude where they will swear that they don't care about aesthetics, but also at the same time claim that whatever they're doing is best for it. And this is something that I verified in my previous video because at the start of it, I laid a little meathead hook, a little bait for big movers. And I knew some people were going to bite and I was not disappointed. In the introduction, I on purpose introduced the words people who lift weights with complete disregard for muscle growth. So the big movers I just described to you. And I had a few people chime in to tell me that whether or not one focuses on muscle growth is irrelevant because a rep is a rep. And to me, this very mindset also participates in the global confusion around bodybuilding because you constantly have people who are attempting to muddy the water. And just like with the example of the lateral raise, it also is not based on anything factual because I can prove to you right now that there is such a thing as an hypertrophy rep and there is such a thing as a rep that is going to be subpar. And to get my point across, I'm going to tell you a story that happened to me just last weekend. An anecdote that is going to paint perfectly the difference between someone who trains for hypertrophy and someone who trains for performance or for strength. So I had a little get together at my house and I have my gym in my basement. And at the start, it was raining outside and I was supposed to grill. So to gain some time, I took a group of people downstairs who wanted to see the gym and I had them compete on a lift. I picked a lift that was extremely safe and easy. It was a wrist roller. So I took a pin, I attached weight, and they were supposed to roll it up. And the goal was to see how much weight they could use. And it was 3 girls and 2 dudes. And when we got started, I expected them to like top out at around 30, 40 pounds. But the more the competition advanced, the more surprised I became. One, because one of the girls was actually a gym rat and she was actually hanging with the dudes. And two, because they were lifting much more than I ever thought they would be able to. Most of the time when you see people using the wrist roller for forearms, they use what? 20, 30 pounds, maybe 40 pounds. These guys went up to 50 pounds for 1 rep max, and the chick actually maxed out at 52 pounds. And seeing this, I was of course extremely curious because 52 pounds is a weight I don't even use for my weights and for my top sets. So I started to load the weight and I started to see how much I could do. And I was extremely surprised to see that I could easily do 70 pounds. And this was because in that moment, I wasn't in an hypertrophy mindset. I was in a big mover mindset. I was just attempting to get the weight up. But at the same time, I know for a fact that I would never be able to use 70, 80 pounds for sets for hypertrophy in my day-to-day training because my form suffered and because my ability to replicate effort and to sustain that amount of intensity was shot. It wasn't possible. This to me perfectly demonstrates that there is a distinct difference between lifting for hypertrophy and horsing weight around. The first focuses on a deliberate execution with a goal in mind, which is to gain muscle, and the other is just intent on getting the weight up regardless of the technique and regardless of the parameters surrounding the lift. So tempo doesn't matter, leverages don't matter, and how you feel during the lift certainly doesn't matter. So stuff like mind-muscle connection, that's out the window. And that to me, as a bodybuilder of course, constitutes ego lifting, because what I did in that basement when I lifted 80 pounds on the wrist roller for 1 rep max was ego lifting, since it simply isn't sustainable for hypertrophy training. Now, it doesn't mean that these big mover reps do nothing, because naturally you're still moving the body around and it's the muscles that move that weight, so the muscles are going to grow. But it might very well be that whatever hypertrophic response or stimulus you will get from, let's say, that 80 pounds wrist roller could be replicated by using 30 pounds less, but using a much slower tempo, being much more controlled and having better form. And I understand that this makes some people scream because weight on the bar is the most important, blah, blah, blah. From experience and from listening to natural bodybuilders, I can tell you that it isn't. Yes, lifting heavy shit is important to get bigger, but you first and foremost have to have the proper technique, you have to have the proper angle to hit the muscle, you have to have the proper tempo, and once that is in place and you standardize all of that with the range of motion, of course, then you can start adding weight. Then it makes sense for hypertrophy. Then you're not just an asshole who is maxing out for the sake of maxing out. Which I understand makes it look like I'm 100% on board with the scientists, because so far the only thing I've been saying is that the meatheads are wrong. Which is weird, because if you've consumed any of my content, you know that I've made multiple videos criticizing science-based training. And I've never really once talked against meathead training or experience-based bro. And the reason for that is very simple. There's nothing to criticize about bro training, because the gist of the argument of it is, it worked for me, so it will work for you. And that's not an argument, it's an opinion. If, for example, you got big biceps doing rows, and you tell people, just do rows, you'll have bigger biceps, and 20% of the people get results and 80% get nothing. They get spaghetti arms. What is your next step? Well, oftentimes with meatheads, the next step is threefold. Either blame the audience, so blame the people you gave shit advice to because they didn't get the results that you expect them to get. 2, tell them to keep going, which is the definition of insanity. You got to like a 3-plate row and your biceps are so small. Telling people to just, row 4 plates, bro, is mind-bogglingly stupid. If the bicep didn't respond to that amount of weight with proper form, it will not respond to more weight. It doesn't work like that. Or 3, and this happens rarely, but these are the best of the meathead bros, people who tell you to just experiment for yourself, who realize that maybe it worked for them, but not for you. These are the guys I vibe with, because if you look at my position on the spectrum, I'm much closer to the bros and the meatheads than I am to the science-based lifters. And that is all a question of methodology. I'm all about methodology. Mine is not based on science at all, it's based on experience. But I have a solid list of now thousands of hours of content that explains exactly my hypertrophy approach. And it's based on arguments that might be right, might be wrong, but you can go in and observe the arguments. Whereas, oftentimes, meathead lifting and meathead methods have no arguments. They're based on nothing because you might have noticed that they're purely antagonistic. Their methodology only comes into existence when it clashes against something else. And this is why oftentimes these guys only really discuss their methods when they're trying to take down other people. So they will look at a science-based influencer, and the science-based influencer will have a methodology, and the meathead will say, oh, well, this is wrong, which is saying something. It means that these people, these influencers, rely more on a mindset than they do on a method. And this is where their strength lays. And ultimately, this is the weakness of the other side. The other side has tremendous methodology, but they have weak mindset. And unfortunately, methods by themselves are not enough, which is something that I am going to demonstrate right now by looking at another footage by Jeff Nippard.
Here are 3 new exercises in phase 2 of my pure bodybuilding program. First, a meadow-style incline lateral raise, where you alternate between going behind your back and in front of your body. These are so good because by lying against an incline bench, you get most resistance from the dumbbell while your delt is most stretched.
So this is a tutorial published by Jeff Nippard in relation to his pure hypertrophy program. There is nothing inherently wrong with the tutorial. I'm not saying that the form he demonstrates is incorrect. Instead, what I want to ask you is, do you notice the problem? Do you notice the thing that is missing from this expose and this demonstration? If you did, congratulations. But if you didn't, let me explain it to you. So, if you look at this video, you notice that all of the lifts are demonstrated at RPE 1. It's because it's there to teach people who have never done the lift how they're supposed to do it with light weight. And indeed, when you start learning a lift, using baby weight at the start to get the form down is extremely important. The problem is, where do you go from there? Just because you have learned how to train the lift properly when it's not challenging does not ensure that your form is going to stay as pristine and clean when you start loading more weight. And this is a huge issue because this is the crux of hypertrophy training. It's the conundrum. How do you maintain clean form for muscle growth even though you're using weights that would make a grown man's head explode? It's very easy to be the asshole that ego lifts and just throws weight around. Anyone can do that. But to be the guy who is clean, focused, and intent when he moves these supramaximal loads, that is a different beast altogether. And this is something that can only be learned by training close to failure. The only way to experience that amount of form breakdown and resist it is to go through it times and times again. It's to get close to that red zone or into that red zone pretty much every single time you train. The problem is that many people, especially the ones that tend to consume a ton of science-based content, never learn to do that. And so they end up turning into the type of lifter that meatheads love to make fun of. It's small dudes who are afraid of going to failure and who justify their weak sauce training with biomechanics or science. And I'm not putting the blame entirely on the Jeff Nippards or the Mike Israeltel of the world, but for having perused their channel and watched a ton of their training, it's hard to disagree with the fact that they very rarely push themselves. It's rare to see these guys go to true failure. Oftentimes, they will be picking lifts that are apparently great for hypertrophy, and they will use a ton of mental gymnastics to justify not loading that lift. But as I've said in part 1, if a lift is good for hypertrophy, it must be loaded. If loading it makes it so that suddenly your form breaks down and you can no longer tap into that crazy effective range of motion, guess what? It's a garbage lift for hypertrophy. And this has direct real-life consequences because I go to a commercial gym and I see these dudes. It's not a strongman. I see guys who do movements that I know because, well, I follow the influencers that make them popular, who use the babiest of weights with shit intensity, slow tempos, and I'm looking at them like, you're going to look the exact same in a year because you're not pushing yourself, but you're hiding behind the excuse of biomechanics or resistance profile, which means that you'll never see the light because these people will dismiss any argument that you try to offer to try to help them. And it's something that as a meathead, experience-based bro, I've had to deal with. I've had people tell me, hey, I would rather listen to this guy because he has a degree and at least his methods are based on science. These are also the types that are going to, times and times again, dodge every difficult hard exercise by citing things like coordination or fatigue as if these things were the devil. As if every time a lift requires a lick of coordination or makes you just slightly fatigued, it has to be kicked to the curb because it's bad. And that is the science-based community that I have an issue with. This is when the meathead in me comes out. And this is best represented by the following clip by Ben Jans.
What's the point of putting a barbell on the front side of your legs whenever you're doing an RDL? When you're doing a free weight RDL without any support, you have to actually manage the position of your knee so that your knee doesn't wobble back and forth like this as you're going through the hinge. But if you put something along the front side of your femur to actually prevent your femur from moving, you can just basically lean into it and use it as an anchor off of which you can perform the hip hinge.
This is where the science bros lose me. Because presenting the free weight RDL as inferior because you have to prevent your knees from wobbling back and forth is fear-mongering, but it's also a load of dysfunctional bullshit. By a show of hands, how many of you watching right now who also train RDLs heavy have ever had that issue? When did you ever had your knees wobble back and forth as you do an RDL? I personally have done tens of thousands of reps of RDLs. I'm currently doing walking sets with 445 for 10 on the RDL. It never happened to me once. I can go to actual failure and drop the weight from my hips up, and I've never had my knees do anything weird or strange on the RDL. And to this you could say, well, maybe it's just you. Maybe it's just anecdote. Okay, I accept this. Let's say that someone has that level of structural instability in their knee when they do a hip hinge. Shouldn't they try and fix it? Shouldn't this be the sign that you are actually dysfunctional and you need to actively work on it instead of trying to work around it? Telling people who can't move normally, because yeah, being able to bend over with weight in your hand without your knees going to Mexico is moving normally, that they should just find a way to not have to do that, is horribly dangerous because it's just avoiding weakness. But weaknesses are always revealed. So it would be much better to meet that weakness and correct it in a controlled environment like a gym where you get to decide how much weight you lift, rather than wait for the day where something happens to you and now that knee weakness becomes the reason why you keel over and you eat the pavement because you couldn't stay stable. It's surely saying a lot that modern hypertrophy training is now intent on eliminating the coordination aspect and challenge of a lift. As if the fact that a lift requires coordination is a bad thing. This is why bodybuilding is being pushed away from fitness, why so many people claim it's not a sport. They have a point. What other sport do you know where people actively try to be as uncoordinated as possible? And this is not just a one-time thing. I'm not here to rant against Ben Jans, whose name I can't even pronounce properly, but the guy has also discouraged people from doing squats because apparently squats take too much coordination. Okay. Discourage people from doing pull-ups, and that's simply not the way I approach hypertrophy. And I'm as much as an hypertrophy bro as you can find, but that is too much even for someone like me. And it is exactly this type of polarizing advice that made hypertrophy training into this niche specific thing nowadays where you're essentially forbidden from doing anything cool. Any lift that would make you feel like a badass is a no-no. But it's too dangerous, bro, it's too fatiguing, bro, coordination, bro, you can do that. Great. We're going to do cable kickbacks and hyperextensions for hours every day. How exciting. Who wants to do that shit? I don't. And I know that I'm not the only person who thinks like this. A lot of people who train for bodybuilding also apply a similar mindset. And this is why there is even a war in the first place, because based on this video, pretty much every single logical argument is on the side of the science-based guys. When it comes to hypertrophy, they're the most logically sound. So how come so many people despises their approach? How come so many people don't like science-based influencers? And how is it possible that the meathead side of the argument is still alive and kicking? Well, that's because the meathead mindset is much more appealing than the biomechanic science-based mindset. If I were to use a family analogy, the science-based crew are like the strict dad that prevents you from eating chocolate and insists that you eat your broccoli and you can't go out after 6 p.m. and you can't play with the dog. And then you have on the other side the cool uncle, the meathead guys, who essentially tell you that you can do whatever the fuck you want, you can go to bed whenever you want, you can eat whatever you want, just have fun and you'll be okay. And yeah, maybe the dad is correct. Maybe he's the one who is looking out for your future. But who gives a fuck about that? No one wants to listen to that, especially when people who follow the Encore way seem to get results. Because this is what has always amused me as well. If the biomechanics science-based way is so much better, how do we explain that these guys aren't bigger than everyone else? I'm not going to verse into the straw man of saying, well, every science-based influencer is small. No, but I can say without a doubt in my mind that they're also not bigger than the experience-based crew. So what gives? They should have pounds on us, but we don't see that. And so you cannot fault people for completely disregarding whatever that side has to say and just follow dudes who are much cooler. And if we're going to talk about cool dudes, I have to introduce the Boogs, who is making his apparition at the end of the video. Because, well, if you've ever listened to the guy, you know that his list of arguments fits on a post-it. Because he's not about arguments. He's not about methodologies. He said it in the past. He doesn't want to be a fitness guru. The guy is about the mindset. And so if I were to summarize what he's been saying for the past 5 fucking years, it's simple. Be intense. Push yourself. Don't even care about your program. Your program is secondary. First and foremost, make sure that whatever you're going to do on that program, you're going to do hardcore. Because if you don't do that, your program is essentially just a laundry list of movements you're going to sandbag. And that is going to get you nowhere. You can have the most optimal exercise selection for hypertrophy. A guy who just goes to the gym and does bench, squats, rows, and pull-ups will mug you if he has the intensity and you don't. And that is because effort is the single most important factor for hypertrophy. Everything else is secondary, which also means that science cannot replace it. Science cannot replace effort. But the good news is that they don't have to be mutually exclusive. This is my real issue and why I wanted to make this video. The problem with these two camps is that they seem to have their own set of attributes, but there's no intersection. What happened to the educated barbarian? What happened to having a brain and also being a savage? Having a plan and having a program is actually the best way to be intense in the gym. Because that way you can be intent, you can be focused, you know what you're doing. Boom, boom, boom. You don't have to guess. You don't have to show up like an asshole and be like, oh, what do I train today? No, you can be like a stone cold killer. And this is how you encourage people to think. And this is my issue with the Meathead side. It's not that they tell people what to think, that's the science-based crew. The Meatheads, rather, their sin is that they tell people not to think. And what I want is the in-between. It's think for yourself. The good news being that, regardless of the side you're on and the champion you follow, these guys are already doing that. Because Bugenhagen can scream as much as he wants. I know for a fact he follows a plan. I know for a fact he's much more intelligent than some people think he is. And I know that nowadays his natural status is a bit dubious, but if you go back in time when he was 100% natty, the guy was 220 with abs with a tremendous physique. And then we also have Jeff Nippard. Jeff Nippard that is often dismissed as small. Look, the guy is not small, he's short. There's a difference. And this is coming from someone who has made many videos criticizing the gimmicky approach to science that he oftentimes employs in his content. Because for him too, it's a facade. Bugenhagen likes to paint himself as a meathead because it's the persona he developed on social media, and it's the same with Jeff. Because if you look at the way Jeff trains, or has trained in the past, he didn't get big off of science. He got big off of hard fucking work. And if you take a look at his recent hypertrophy program, you will also see that for a fact, because the majority of the volume comes from compound movements. It's not like it's a program that has you do only like iliac pull downs and behind the back lateral raises, no. But on the outside, if you look at these two personalities, that's not what you're going to get. And this is the risk of social media, and it's the risk of this scientist versus meatheads ideological battle that relies a ton on appearances, which tends to divide people when in reality, the middle ground, at least in terms of methodology, is there. And that shouldn't surprise anyone. The issue with the pendulum is that it swings to the extremes. And whenever it reaches the extreme of pure meathead or pure science, it's unbalanced and it tends to produce worst advice for the people who listen to it. But the good thing is that you don't have to buy into that hype. You can just stay in the middle. You don't have to follow the pendulum because you're not an influencer. Influencers do this because they get money and fame from it. You don't. Please don't turn yourself into a caricature just to resemble someone that is not even what they portray themselves as. But that is going to conclude this video, which was part 2. Now, what about part 3? Well, in part 3, my goal is going to be to present every single fitness quote on social media to help you avoid the pendulum, to help you not become a caricature by, in a sense, presenting all of these scams, all of their gimmicks, the psychological approach that they use to attract people, but also all of the illogical bullshit that they carry with them, because yes, every single side is to some degree full of shit, and it is always my pleasure to point it out for you guys. I'm going to see you very soon. Thank you for watching. Have a good night.